My name is Walter Edwards. I'm the director of the Humanities Center, which is sponsoring this event today. We are a small center with a modest endowment, a portion of which is used to support the 10 programs that we run. As you came in, you might have picked up a handout to show the 10 programs we are supporting. And the Marilyn Williamson Endowed Faculty Fellowship is one of them. We are devoted to promoting interdisciplinary thinking, interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary scholarship, and interdisciplinary creative endeavors among humanities, social sciences, and arts faculty here at Wayne, and to provide funding to faculty and students to support their work. I'm proud to say that last September we celebrated our 20th anniversary of service to Wayne State University, and I thank you all for supporting us over these years. I know that you're here to listen to a stimulating talk by Dora Apel, but I hope you can bear with me while I acknowledge the generosity of the estate of the late Marilyn Williamson for the very generous endowment which is funding this program. It is an annual award of $20,000 given competitively to a humanities faculty member who submits a proposal that the center deems to have the potential to make an exceptional contribution to the humanities, and which is predicted to bring high scholarly or artistic recognition to Wayne State University. Professor Dora Apel submitted such a proposal last year, and thus became the second recipient of this award, and we shall shortly hear some of the results of her project. But first, a little bit about our donor. Marilyn Williamson died on February 9, 2010. She had a distinguished career as a professor of English with a focus on the work of William Shakespeare, Renaissance drama, and British literature. She first taught at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. She was then appointed chair of the Department of English at Wayne State here, and she subsequently served as Associate Dean for the College of Liberal Arts and then Provost of this university. Her scholarship was recognized first by the Wayne State University Board of Governors with a Faculty Recognition Award, and then she was appointed a Distinguished Professor of the university. She is a patron of the arts and a dedicated supporter of the Michigan Opera Theater, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, and the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. Clearly, Dr. Williamson was a discerning and selective donor. That is why the Humanities Center is honored to be the recipient of our philanthropy, and that's why we are careful to select scholars that would honor her name and legacy. Our moderator today in the program that we have in front of us is Jeffrey Yapt. He is a professor in the Art and Art History Department and has been a faculty member here at Wayne since 1989. In addition to being an artist, he's a prolific writer. His publications include A Museum on the Verge, A Socioeconomic History of the Detroit Institute of Arts, 1882 to 2000, which was published by Wayne State University Press. And he has an essay entitled The Origins of the Public Museum, which is published in a companion to Museum Studies published by Blackwell in 2006. His most recent book, American Egyptologist, The Life of James Breasted, and the creation of his Oriental Institute, was published in 2012 by the University of Chicago Press. Therefore, we have an outstanding scholar introducing an outstanding scholar. So it's apt that Jeff be the moderator of these proceedings. So without any further ado, to keep you away from this stimulating talk, I pass on the baton to Professor Dora to Professor Jeff Apt, who is going to introduce Dora. Professor Apt.
I'm raising this microphone purely for the pleasure of watching Dora lower it. I've been thinking about introducing speakers a little bit before Dora invited me to introduce her for her lecture today, because our conference, our big annual conference, is coming up in a couple of weeks, and I'm sharing 2 sessions there where I'll be introducing 10 people over the course of 2 different sessions, so it's been on my mind. Introductions of speakers are one of those rituals of academic life that seem not to attract as much thought as they might. They're intended to be a form of validation, to explain to us why we should take seriously the work of the scholar whose work we are about to hear. As a kind of intellectual foreplay, if they're done just right, they serve to arouse one's curiosity and desire, hopefully bringing us to a fevered pitch of anticipation. All too often, however, those introductions can be too long or too short, inappropriate or mystifying, leaving us in a sort of dazed and awkward stupor before we can even reach the main event. I recall one very long-winded and terribly misguided introduction done by a rabbi for a very distinguished and well-known biblical scholar. When the scholar finally reached the podium to begin his talk, he thanked his introducer by saying, "Of all the introductions I've ever received, this was the most recent." There are many reasons why Dora Apel is so well qualified to speak to us today about her subject. As the W. Hawkins Ferry Chair in the Duffy Department of Art and Art History here at Wayne State, Dora had already authored 3 books and co-authored another before her most recent book, World War Culture and the Contest of Images, was published last year by Rutgers University Press. She has published nearly 20 articles and book chapters, and she has delivered well over 20 papers at scholarly conferences, universities, and museums throughout the United States and abroad. All of these, above and beyond her many writings and papers done in the service of the cultural institutions and intellectual life of Southeast Michigan. Put another way, Dora is a highly productive scholar who has made a large number of significant contributions to the intellectual discourse of our time. It is equally important to note that Dora has done her work in a comparatively new area of scholarship, visual culture studies, an approach that draws into the once narrow ambit of art history a much wider variety of the images that surround us and the methods by which we might investigate them. From tattooed Jews, to lynching photographs, to the visual representations and repercussions of war, Dora has opened new spaces for thinking about the ways images circulate through and inform our lives. In our era of topical hyperspecialization, however, some might regard Dora's range of subjects as perhaps too disparate. Yet a closer study of her work reveals an underlying purposefulness that links her choice of subjects and her approach to them. In addition to asking what things mean, Dora also asks, what is just? By posing that question, she takes on a challenge that most scholars aren't trained to shoulder. It is the task of balancing the demands of rigorous and theoretically objective research methods that have been steadily advancing the last couple of centuries, with the far more ancient and profound goal of bending those pursuits toward the betterment of society. Dora's work is anything but the kind of pointless, anodyne research that occupies too much space in contemporary scholarship. For those of us who know Dora well, she doesn't take things lightly. Whether addressing a beleaguered student's problems, our institution's proclivity toward trampling the most vulnerable among us, or the harsh ethos of contemporary society, Dora instead brings to her subjects not only the rigor of a well-trained scholar, but the zeal of a social activist. In her willingness to pose uncomfortable questions, whether to colleagues in a faculty meeting or the world of scholarship regarding subjects we thought we knew. Dora possesses a courageousness that's all too rare in the precincts of modern scholarship. It is my honor to provide Dora Apel's most recent introduction and to invite you to join me in welcoming Dora and her lecture on Detroit and the global ruin imaginary.
Thank you so much for that very generous and thoughtful introduction. And I'd also like to offer my heartfelt thanks to Walter Edwards and his staff and the Humanities Center for the Marilyn Williamson Award and for arranging this reception and occasion for this lecture today. I want to say that this talk is drawn from a book that I'm working on, which is also called Detroit and the Global Ruin Imaginary. So, in this talk, I want to explore some of the sources of pleasure, horror, and fascination evoked by ruins and the imagery of ruins, as well as the debate provoked by the freighted construct of ruin porn. I also want to theorize the concepts of the global ruin imaginary as an expanding network of images, and the concept of the deindustrial sublime as the primary strategy for ruin representation. But I also want to focus on Detroit as central to these issues. Though Detroit was once one of the wealthiest cities in the United States, German news media recently crowned the debt-ridden German city of Oberhausen Germany's Detroit. This is just one example of using Detroit, now the largest city ever to declare bankruptcy, as a universal signifier of urban decline. Detroit is seen as the paradigmatic city of ruins and the mecca of urban explorers from across the United States and Europe and other parts of the world who are drawn to a city that seems to embody both total disaster and open-ended possibility. The images of Detroit's ruination have rapidly proliferated in the last decade especially, and have found their way onto hundreds, if not thousands, of websites, and have become the subject of books, exhibitions, films, plays, television programs, corporate advertising, and journalistic reportage. In other words, Detroit has become a global metaphor for the current state of neoliberal capitalism and the epicenter of the photographic genre of post-industrial ruin imagery. I want to argue that the global appeal of Detroit's ruin imagery and of ruin gazing more generally portends a pervasive and growing cultural and political pessimism, a loss of faith in rationality and progress, and a widespread concern that decline is inevitable and the end times are approaching. My premise is a simple one. The pervasive fear of global decline feeds an enormous appetite for ruin imagery. The capitalist order seems to be approaching apocalyptic collapse, whether through viral pandemics, global warming, ecological destruction and struggles for limited resources, or the explosive growth of social inequality and exclusionary practices. As a result, ruin imagery, although it offers a variety of perspectives, has become a way of attempting to cope with and to domesticate the fears and anxieties of decline. This helps to explain the explosion of ruin images across formats, which form a global network of images. This network expands outwards with centripetal force and accumulating cultural currency, constituting the global ruin imaginary, and establishing patterns of connection or nodal points to every sphere of life. I further want to suggest that in the global network of the ruin imaginary, the crucial, if not pivotal, nodal point is the imagery of Detroit, with its empty downtown skyscrapers, abandoned factories, and derelict houses as the iconic images of urban decline. In the cultural imagination, the idea of Detroit, rather than its actual complexities and contradictions, serves as the quintessential urban nightmare. This makes Detroit the critical example of the post-apocalyptic, deindustrialized city in the era of neoliberal globalization. My argument about the issues at stake in Detroit and its ruin imagery is premised on the understanding that the plight of Detroit presages the future of other deindustrialized cities across the country. Yet the plight of Detroit has reached such catastrophic proportions because the city also occupies a unique position in terms of its racial history, among other issues. So one question for my study is this: is it an accident that Detroit, an overwhelmingly black city, which is now the poorest city in the nation, is bordered on the north by some of the wealthiest suburbs in the country, which are overwhelmingly white? In addition to Detroit's abandonment by the auto companies to avoid unionization and municipal oversight, decades of racial discrimination in jobs, education, and housing played a crucial role in creating the desperately impoverished African American city, forcing the black population to bear the brunt of the burden of deindustrialization. Moreover, Detroit has been allowed to languish, or rather, it has been actively undermined by state and federal policies which are still ongoing. This is a subject I explore further in the book, but don't have time to develop further here. I would just like to say that any strategy for solving Detroit's problems will require the integration of city resources with the affluent surrounding suburbs in a form of regional reorganization and centralized planning that would serve the needs of everyone. Ironically then, in one of the few examples of regional cooperation, the people of Detroit and surrounding suburbs in 2012 endorsed a tax initiative to fund the Detroit Institute of Arts, putting it on a secure financial footing for the first time in decades, and giving residents of these counties free admission to the museum. This initiative would be voided by a sell-off of major works, as the city's creditors have proposed. Such a sell-off would be the equivalent of looting the museum, not unlike the looting that took place in Baghdad during the US invasion of Iraq, and a significant loss of cultural capital. As one of the city's greatest institutions, moreover, the decline of the DIA would not only not solve the city's problems, it would further weaken the city through cultural impoverishment, affecting real estate values and donations to other cultural institutions, which in turn would pave the way for further financial failure down the road. At the same time, it would promote the widening separation of art and culture from everyday life, especially for the poor and working class, a condition already reflected in the fact that art and music programs have been drastically cut in public schools across the nation. Some other key questions are these. If Detroit is a metonym for global urban decline, what has made the city such a magnet for ruin gazers, millennials, artists, entrepreneurial creatives, and venture capitalists such as Dan Gilbert? What makes Detroit ruin imagery so compelling and so vexed? And what role does it play in the global ruin imaginary? On one level, the growing anxiety of decline, suggested by the explosion of ruin imagery, may be understood as the dark side of modernity. Modernity was founded on a set of universalist values stemming from the Enlightenment that supported ideals of progress and rationality through science and technology. As the birthplace of the auto industry and the assembly line and the former industrial powerhouse of the nation, Detroit was seen as the motor force of modernity. We can thus fairly say that the ruins of Detroit are seen to signify modernity itself in ruins. On the other hand, modernity has fostered the growth of disaster capitalism, the unparalleled power of the security and surveillance state, the global movement of capital to wherever labor and resources are cheapest, and the privatization of government services, which vastly impoverishes masses of people and destroys the Earth's ecology in ways never before even possible, all in the service of producing extraordinary wealth and power for a privileged elite. The global ruin imaginary therefore reflects the erosion of faith in a future that excludes the many and privileges the few. Between 2000 and 2012, the real wages of young high school graduates declined 13%, and the real wages of young college graduates declined 9%. For the first time in decades, the current generation has a lower standard of living than their parents. And yet, as incomes have declined, with 1/3 of all working families making below the poverty threshold, corporate profits have soared. Moreover, the gap between the wealthy elite and the poor has widened exponentially and continues to widen. So the imagery of ruination grapples with and attempts to ameliorate the terrors and anxieties of a seemingly irreversible decline. As these fears grow, the threshold required for compensatory aesthetic pleasure also grows, requiring more extreme expressions of ruin and disaster to be mentally mastered in order to achieve a sense of safety. This aesthetic pleasure is achieved through what I call the deindustrial sublime, which is necessarily in dialogue with the aesthetic of the romantic sublime. In the 18th century, scenes of ruin due to natural disasters became both spectacles of eerie beauty and testaments to the awesome, humbling power of nature. The experience of the sublime occurred when the spectator could take delight in experiencing these effects while escaping their ravages. This meant that the experience of the sublime was a mental experience, not an external event. Distance and safety were crucial conditions for the enjoyment of a scene that would otherwise be too terrifying to endure. Similarly, today, the distance afforded by the safe remove of imagery in the ruin imaginary allows for the domestication and taming of the anxieties of decline. We aestheticize our own disintegration at a safe remove through representation, making it both bearable and aesthetically pleasing. Yet, at the core of the deindustrial sublime is a recognition that ruination is the result of violent political and cultural processes, from which only the wealthy few are exempt. For the past 2 decades, Detroit's deindustrialization and urban decline has been represented in a burgeoning array of exhibitions and photography books, as well as scholarly anthologies and books that explore ruination more broadly, with titles such as Modern Ruins, Ghostly Ruins, Industrial Ruins, and Beauty and Decay. The democratization of imagery through the quick and relatively inexpensive means of digital imagery makes the wide production, reproduction, and distribution of such images easily accomplished on an ever greater variety of media sites and formats. In addition, post-apocalyptic narratives set in a ruined world play a dominant role in video games, in a burgeoning zombie culture, and zombie popular films and television shows, such as Low Winter Sun, that continually expand the network of ruin imagery. For some people, however, ruin images, especially Detroit ruin images, taken by outsiders, constitutes ruin porn, a derisive term that implies ruin imagery of a prurient nature, which is titillating, superficial, and rapidly consumed. Ruin porn suggests that the ruin aesthetic is a vulgarization and trivialization of the historical significance of ruination. The term was possibly coined by Detroit blogger and photographer James D. Griffon, who used it to criticize photographers who came from elsewhere to shoot the ruins of Detroit. It may be surprising to discover then that Griff Owen himself has posted many ruin images on his website, including a series of feral houses that are abandoned and overgrown with vegetation, images of vacant lots, detritus at unidentified abandoned plants, the effects of scrappers, and the former Detroit Public Schools book depository, where a small box elder tree grows out of a carpet of rotting textbooks, as you see on your right. His ruin photographs also have been published in magazines such as Vice, Harper's, and the Oprah magazine, and exhibited in Los Angeles, Atlanta, Chicago. His ruin porn critique, thus, appears to apply only to outsiders who come to Detroit to shoot the ruins, and sets up a dichotomy between insiders who effectively own the ruins and outsiders whose photos he regards as voyeuristic and others regard as voyeuristic and exploitative, if not shaming and humiliating. Yet there are plenty of local photographers, in addition to Griff Owen, who shoot the ruins with a focus on their aesthetic effects and the beauty of decay. Therefore, it is not remiss to ask, do they really do something different? Insiders argue that the imagery of ruination produced by outsiders feeds off the city's misery for pleasure or gain, while understanding nothing about its problems, histories, and dreams. Outsiders argue they are documenting the real by making visible that which otherwise might remain invisible and unexamined, although they also focus on the aesthetic effects of ruination and the beauty of decay. If we compare two photos of the same house on Walden Street, one by Griff Owen and one by the New York-based photographer Andrew Moore, we can see that the images are almost identical in subject matter, even though one of these photographers hotly refuses the ruin porn appellation and insists on a different set of good intentions. We could also say that Moore is the better photographer. But we must say that if ruin imagery exoticizes and fetishizes decline, then it applies to the work of both insiders and outsiders. If we compare Griff Owen's photo of a box elder taking root at the school's book depository with Moore's photo of birches growing in decayed books at the same book depository, we can again see the similarity of both site and subject. However, the perspective in Moore's photograph is arguably less bleak than in Griff Owen's, and again proves to be the more compelling image. For most viewers, distinctions between insiders and outsiders may well appear to be subjective constructions that are not visually discernible in the photographs, making clearly defined differences in representation moot and suggesting that the dichotomy is false. The larger fear, fueled by the proliferation of ruin imagery, is that the continuing marginalization and alienation of this city from the host nation that views the ruins of Detroit from a position of aestheticized fascination at a comfortable remove. I don't think that was a sentence. The larger fear is that this kind of imagery continues to marginalize and alienate Detroit from the larger body of the nation, and that outsiders see the city from a privileged position at a remove. And this is an understandable fear. On the other hand, filmmaker Michael Channon argues that the resistant responses of insiders to outside filmmakers and photographers arise from a fear of representation, of the exposure to ridicule of an object of attachment. Channon asserts that it may indeed make a difference whether a filmmaker is an insider or an outsider, but observes what the xenophobe fails to allow is the validity of the stranger's perspective and the representation of what the other sees. Behind this rejection is the fear that what others say may turn out to be true. This view is echoed by Detroit-based photographer Michelle Andonian, who observes that people in Detroit are angered by what they perceive as ruin porn because they may suddenly see their own city through a different lens, compelling them to recognize that they have become so accustomed to ruination that they stopped seeing it long ago. Channon further reminds us that both insiders and outsiders produce work that is shaped by subjective perspectives, and it cannot be otherwise. The goal of the contemporary documentarian is, rather, to make his or her subject position and point of view visible, to claim the frame by which the image is constructed and meaning structured. Indeed, many ruins are actually invisible to society at large because they are not memorialized in any way and because there is no consensus about what caused them. Unlike the cathedral at Coventry or Ground Zero in Hiroshima, Detroit's ruins were not caused by an act of war or some other spectacular event, but are instead the result of more gradual and hidden processes of disinvestment, emigration, and racialized discrimination. Their general invisibility is compounded by the fact that they tend to be located in poor and minority neighborhoods. Detroit's ruins were discovered by the national media during the build-up to the 2006 Super Bowl game held in Detroit, when reporters came to the city to produce pre-game stories, saw for the first time the acres of abandoned factories, storefronts, office buildings, churches, schools, houses, and vacant lots with which Detroiters have been living in states of continuous transformation for decades. The insider mentality often lends itself to forms of city boosterism and defensiveness that obscure or ignore the politics of corporate capitalism and the culpability of the auto companies for the state of the city. As George Steinmetz notes, politicians, local developers, city planners, and many community activists are virtually compelled to strike an optimistic, even Pollyanna-ish pose in the hope of luring residents and investors back to the crumbling city. In particular, the artists who have embraced the city often feel vulnerable and betrayed by what they perceive as bad press. The complaint is usually heard, what about all the good things? There are indeed many good things in the city, including its DIY spirit, its neighborhood initiatives, its art institutions, colleges and universities, its galleries, museums, dance, theater, music, performance, and literary scenes, and its hardworking, dedicated citizens, and of course its university. But these things are not supposed to be news. They're supposed to be normal. As journalist Charlie LaDuff observes, when normal things become the news, the abnormal becomes the norm. It may be argued, nonetheless, that Detroit has lost control of its own representation, that the city has been pathologized through the proliferating images of decay, which have turned the urban dystopia into a city whose ruination bleeds metonymically into a discourse about human ruins who are blamed for the damaged condition of their environment. Many outsiders, in other words, including many whites in Detroit's suburbs, blame the city's own population for its ruination. As a black city, this racist perspective constructs the city as the nation's dark other, in both literal and figurative terms, a city to be isolated, feared, and cut off from the body of the nation, in blind denial of the decaying ruins already found in declining cities all across America. If ruin porn means reveling in the sensual materiality of ruins at the expense of historical understanding, then it has merit as a critique, regardless of who takes the pictures. If, on the other hand, ruin porn means that the motives of outsiders who visually represent the city are automatically suspect, or that the ruins themselves are too embarrassing to represent, then it is far too narrow and defensive a concept. My interest is not in the pictured ruination of architecture and landscape for its own sake, but in how ruin imagery is used to obscure or reveal the ongoing relations of capital and power that structure the processes of ruination and its effects on the lives of people. A standard trope of the ruin imaginary is the architecture of decay and vacant lots being reclaimed by nature, suggesting a timeless struggle between nature and culture. Some have argued that nature has always been part of the city and that we should conceive of nature in a positive way, as helping to create new urban ecologies. But the ideological recuperation of nature within the city does not say enough about its social and cultural ramifications. More significant than the actual functions of nature in the city are the political repercussions of representing nature and the architecture of decay. Urban geographer Nate Millington argues that the metaphor of nature reclaiming the city, whether used in negative or redemptive terms, neutralizes the actual processes that have a destructive impact on the city, such as the virulent racism, anti-unionism, and industrial restructuring that are the critical factors in Detroit. This is important for understanding why Detroit ruin imagery contains a notable absence of people, and why many observers often don't realize there are still hundreds of thousands of residents in the city. The pervasive narrative that Detroit is a poor black city that has only itself to blame for its problems raises the suspicion that the overwhelming invisibility of the city's residents in most ruin photography is not accidental. If the victims of the city's decline disappear, it makes the discourse of ruination about architecture, structuring it in terms of the inevitable reclamation of the city by nature, while suggesting a return to a primitive, pre-civilized state or a new ecological idol. Presenting a landscape that is empty and regressing to the past or waiting for new creative uses displaces the discourse about people and the effects of abandonment and decay on their lives. To claim that the deindustrialization of Detroit is part of a timeless struggle between nature and culture, as many photographers do, ignores the real and specific political and economic factors leading to the city's decline, which are far from natural. Photography that focuses only on the beauty of decay and architecture offers a narrative that distances and obscures the ongoing crisis of poverty and unemployment. Moreover, the invisibility of the black populace to photographers reflects and reinforces their invisibility to the corporations and policymakers that are the real agents of decline, those who help to create the patterns of ghettoized, racialized poverty that have long obtained in the cities, while simultaneously washing their hands of that responsibility. A good example of this kind of representation is the front page of the New York Times, which utilized 3 photos to accompany its article announcing a federal judge's ruling that Detroit was formally qualified to enter bankruptcy without protections for city pensions. The top photo is the iconic Michigan Central Station, an abandoned grand civic structure that serves today as an anti-monument for the city and a symbol of city failure. The photo was taken by the French team of Yves Marchand and Romain Meffre. Below that are 2 more color photos by Marchand and Meffre: the ballroom of the Lee Plaza Hotel with its beautifully painted ceiling and overturned piano, and a water-damaged classroom with peeling paint and a few desks randomly scattered about at the St. Margaret Mary School. From these photos, one might imagine that Detroit was already a ghost town. Inside, on page 20, is a huge photo of the Packard plant, taken from an angle that emphasizes its crumbling decrepitude. Beneath it is a much smaller photo of a demonstration outside the federal courthouse where black protesters carry signs saying, "People, not banks," and "Support good jobs in Detroit, support Detroit families, support Detroit pensions." So instead of highlighting an active human presence and the combative local response to the judge's ruling, the front page trio of ruin photos representing the failed civic monument The opulent architecture of a once prosperous heyday and the dashed hopes for the next generation suggest an already dead and mummified city. This is reinforced by the bold-faced caption, "Visions of a Lost City," which in turn provides ideological support for the cutting of city pensions. If the city is already lost, no need to worry about the sacrifice of the thousands of people who are fighting to survive or to preserve their meager incomes. Pensions only average $19,000 a year. Yet these images of civic institutions, former hotels, abandoned schools, and derelict factories reiterate and reproduce key icons of the ruin imaginary that can be seen in declining towns and cities across the nation. Cities that are also in the process of imposing further austerities on their own impoverished populations. A New York Times front page headline the very next day announced, "Chicago pursues deal to change pension funding." Sociologist Camilo Jose Vergara has been among the most systematic photographers, returning to the city over the course of decades to re-photograph sites and document transformations over time. Vergara was criticized in the mid-90s, however, for the proposal to preserve Detroit's abandoned 1920s-era skyscrapers. On the one hand, Vergara hoped to preserve buildings designed by nationally known architects such as Daniel Burnham, George Post, Albert Kahn, and McKim White from the Wrecking Ball. On the other hand, he felt they possessed an Athenian splendor redolent of a lost civilization. Thus, his suggestion that a skyscraper park in downtown Detroit as an American acropolis and a memorial to a disappearing civilization evoked a firestorm of controversy by seeming to give up hope for revitalization and renewal. The photography team of Marchand and Meffre, both born in the Parisian suburbs, embarked on a 5-year collaboration on Detroit ruins, starting in 2005, and they were 24 and 18 years old at the time, which resulted in the book, The Ruins of Detroit. We've seen a number of their images already, including this one on the front page of the New York Times. Their introductory text sets out their perspective, which naturalizes Detroit's decline in abstract historical terms as a kind of inevitable process, speaking of the volatile result of a change of era and the fall of empires, and a natural and sublime demonstration of our human destinies and their paradoxes, a dramatization of our creative and self-destructive vanities. Pretty vague. They also refer to Detroit as that contemporary Pompeii, with all the archetypal buildings of an American city in a state of mummification. For them, the city is no less dead than the ancient city of Pompeii, whose inhabitants were expunged in one fell swoop by the volcanic forces of nature. This view is confirmed by their photographs, which are taken in dark, overcast, light conditions, making them feel cold, as well as devoid of people. Like many urban explorers, Marchand and Meffre articulate the deindustrial sublime by offering a poignant and mournful testament to decline while commemorating the city's picturesque aesthetic. Only 2 images in the book's nearly 230 pages feature recognizable humans, and these from a distance. One of them being the very last photo that pictures what is likely the photographers themselves as 2 tiny silhouettes walking down an alley amid the derelict buildings of the Packard plant. As a farewell image, the alley appears to be an empty street and the desolate plant a metonym for the city, which by implication is also empty and abandoned. Okay. Trained at Princeton with photographer Emmett Gowan, Andrew Moore covers similar territory to that of Marchand and Meffre, who invited the older photographer to join them in 2008, introducing Moore to Detroit. These are 2 of his images that you're already familiar with. Moore and the French photographers often shot the same subjects, but with subtle differences. Moore doesn't see the city as mummified, like Marchand and Meffre, but his vision of the city's regeneration is based on its reclamation by nature. He emphasizes the relationship of nature and culture, with nature in the ascendancy, as in House on Walden Street and Birches Growing in Decaying Books. This view of nature as a metaphor of resurrection suggests a redemptive role for nature in secular guise, smuggling in what in the past would have been a religious truth or revelation, while eliding and neutralizing the political forces of decline. Like Marchand and Meffre, this view also naturalizes and romanticizes Detroit's decline. Focusing on the natural forces of entropy as unstoppable, Moore describes his aesthetic as a romantic sense of horror and beauty, and his photographic concerns being the forces of entropy, color and detail, and the drama of light and weather. Overall, Marchand and Meffre and Andrew Moore offer seemingly opposite yet parallel approaches. Marchand and Meffre's somber photographs, cool and drained of life, suggest a lamentation for a state of irreversible decline and mortal rigor, while Moore's photographs, warm and vibrant with color, offer a commemorative tribute to the beauty of decay and the resurgence of nature. But these are flip sides of the same aesthetic strategy. One laments city decline as a deindustrialized wasteland, yet finds beauty in decay. The other, conversely, engages in romanticized reveries on the struggle between nature and culture, and finds beauty in decay. These approaches are integral to the ruin imaginary and to the perspective of the worldwide urban explorer movement. Urban exploration is a movement that has attracted tens of thousands of followers. Detroit has become a mecca for urban explorers who roam the ruins for their strange beauty and liberating transgressive possibilities as alternative spaces. The focus of most urban explorers is on individual experience rather than historical inquiry. Premised on an understanding of history as an inevitable cycle of creation and destruction, this ethos promotes philosophical resignation and an embrace of decline. The aestheticized ruins in the Urbex book Beauty and Decay, for example, which you see here, are presented without historical context, instead fetishizing decay for its own sake in an attempt to establish an affirmative ethics of ruination, and even inserting staged figures wearing masks, as we see on the book's cover, or distorting the image to create eerie effects. The book's authors frankly describe the allure of urbex as a search for escape and adventure. As a dangerous and thrilling experience, thrilling because it's dangerous, ruin exploration offers a landscape of collapsed boundaries and liberating forms of transgression that include not only trespass and discovery, but also secret spaces for parties, sex, drugs, games, and other activities that are free from bourgeois convention, public surveillance, and normative regulations. We might see the uncanny pleasure of ruin exploration and its representations as suggesting two simultaneous and seemingly opposed perspectives. On one hand, the contemplation of ruins provides a sense of superiority and comfort for having survived the collapse of past dreams of a future, as art critic Brian Dillon puts it. On the other hand, the contemplation of ruins paradoxically produces a sense of being cast forward into the future ruin of our own present. From both perspectives, the urban explorer is a survivor, seeking immersive sensual pleasure that is suspended in time or allows an unfolding of ambiguous time that moves backwards and forwards simultaneously. Ruin gazing is thus an exciting way of containing and controlling the anxiety of decline and the cultural pessimism it produces. Like other urban explorers, Julia Taubman is not interested in stopping the forces of entropy either. In an interview with Vogue magazine, Taubman said about her photo book, Detroit, 138 square miles, "If the book is about anything, it's about these buildings as monuments. No one should tear these buildings down, but no one should rehabilitate them either." We might ask how this is fundamentally different from Vergara's suggestion of an American acropolis that outraged so many. Perhaps the difference of 15 years or so of continuing decline is the difference between outrage and acceptance. Or perhaps nostalgia for the ruins that have become part of the city's urban fabric for so long has become more fully embedded, recognizing that the ruins incorporate different layers of the city's history and create alternative spaces that could potentially coexist with other kinds of urban development, something akin to Tacheles in Berlin, a ruined department store taken over by up to 80 artists that existed for 22 years before the artists were evicted for capitalist redevelopment. In his essay for Taubman's book, Jerry Herron criticizes the practitioners of ruin porn and their urge for drive-by solutions, while praising Taubman's photographs as representing an insider's view of what it feels like and looks like to live with this place. Herron is hard-pressed, however, to describe what it feels like and looks like. Perhaps the diatribes against images by outsiders are driven by a sense of powerlessness and the inability to act against the ruination. This evokes feelings of anger and resentment, not against the conditions of the city directly, but against the pictures that convey them and seem to make those conditions worse simply by publicizing them, making the city seem alien and pathetic, and, perhaps worst of all, provoking pity as a depersonalized response to distant suffering, akin to seeing pictures of starving children in Africa. And perhaps we all share this contradiction of being drawn to ruin images of Detroit and resenting their proliferation by outside photographers. On one hand, ours is an age in which we are all seduced by ruins. Ruins have been integral to the modern era since its beginning, though how we perceive them has changed significantly, from the ruins of classical antiquity to the ruins of war to the ruins of deindustrialized cities and neoliberal decline. On the other hand, we want to maintain control of the city's representation, even as it has come to stand in for urban decline itself, at the center of the global ruin imaginary. Like Taubman's photo, we see the city through a frame of ruination, yet long for the ideal-looking city in the distance. Artists who attempt to effect social transformation through public projects can be important agents of political agitation or cultural critique. I just want to include a couple of quick examples of this. A Detroit project that defied reactions of local incomprehension and unexpected expense in order to assert a critique of the national housing crisis and its destructive effects in Detroit was the architectural work Ice House Detroit. Gregory Home and Matthew Raydun produced the work by pouring gallons and gallons of water over an abandoned house in Detroit and letting it freeze, filming the process and photographing the final state. Home and Raydun worked in 24-hour shifts for several weeks during the coldest part of winter, using a fire hose to build up the ice in layers. Although Ice House Detroit creates a sense of being frozen in time, it exists within an animate landscape, suggesting both immobility and inexorable devolution. It conveys the sense of a future that is already past, addressing the mortgage foreclosure crisis, which disproportionately hit areas where most residents are Black, Latino, or Asian, as well as the elderly who live on fixed incomes. And yet the stark beauty of the image is darkly compelling, aestheticizing decline, even as it reflects a loss of faith in the ideals of reason, order, and progress. By drawing on the aesthetic of the deindustrial sublime to create an object of uncanny beauty, Ice House Detroit both evokes and temporarily domesticates the terror of homelessness, while conveying the contradictions of capitalism and its effects on people. It confronts us with a haunting vision of the foreclosed future that contains within it a cold and terrible violence. Another public art project involved an anonymous group of 4 artists, at least one of whom is here today, who produced Object Orange, a series of guerrilla actions in which the artists painted abandoned and structurally unsafe houses bright orange. This drew attention to the dangerously derelict structures and to the problem of abandoned houses blighting the city. The artists painted 16 homes starting in 2006, making most of them visible from freeways to the northern white suburbs. The audience for the project then was not the neighbors of the houses, who were already well aware of the decaying houses in their neighborhoods, but commuters to the suburbs who might otherwise easily ignore them. Of the first 11 houses painted, 4 were almost immediately demolished, and more have been demolished since then. The city, however, viewed the project as criminal vandalism and claimed the demolitions were coincidental. Ice House of Troy and Object Orange are also an important part of the ruin imaginary and play a more critical role within it. So to conclude, the issue for urban explorers, such as Taubman, Moore, Marchand, and Meffre, is what kind of ruin imaginary their photography helps to produce. Does their work participate in reflecting and constructing the dominant narrative of Detroit and deteriorating cities more generally as a story about inevitable decline or a natural downward spiral of progress and decay? Does it focus primarily or exclusively on architecture and landscape, or the struggle between nature and culture? I would say that all of them do in their own way, even as some of them produce gorgeous images or attempt to multiply connections between ruination and life in the city. But it must be understood that this is central to the nature of the ruin imaginary. Ruin images can lament, elegize, or celebrate the ruins. They can even implicitly critique the forces or effects of decline. They can embrace those effects as beautiful or melancholic, but they cannot disguise the halt in progress that ruins represent. And this halt in progress evokes the anxieties of eroding faith in a better future that drives the ruin imaginary. The appeal and fascination of the ruin imaginary, manifest through the aesthetic of the deindustrial sublime, is paradoxically predicated on the fragmentation and violence at its core. By taking pleasure in the beauty of ruins, we establish the mental distance that allows us to contain and control the anxiety of decline and the threat of being overwhelmed. The contemporary ruin imaginary, even as it continues to be romanticized, is thus deeply imbued by the apocalyptic imagination. Its grip on contemporary consciousness is growing, not abating, as confidence in the state and the capitalist system continues to erode. The proliferation of ruin imagery, especially since 9/11, therefore embodies the fears and anxieties of our era, which is one of increasing poverty, declining wages and social services, inadequate health care, unemployment, homelessness, growing migrant populations, and ecological degradation. But the growth of the ruin imaginary also helps open up the space for radical action that would reorganize economic and social relations along rational lines, to genuinely serve the needs of the Earth's masses and husband the Earth's resources. It is my conviction that if global capitalism is headed towards collapse, ruination and its imagery must be mobilized in the service of an anti-capitalist, emancipatory struggle against the global order. Thank you so much.
We have time as planned for comments and questions, and I hope you won't hesitate. If you do have any questions or comments, it would help us all if you would stand up and enunciate slowly and clearly and as loudly as your voice will allow the question and comment so everybody can hear you. Yes?
Dora, I wondered if you had seen in this week's New Yorker the profile of L. Brooks Patterson.
No, I didn't see that.
Okay, the headline or the title was Drop Dead Detroit.
Oh,
It didn't use his name. You should look at it because you mentioned the wealthiest suburbs to the north, and you mentioned how connected it is with capitalism. And I couldn't tell from the article whether they were lionizing that L. Brooks Patterson had managed to keep Oakland County so prosperous despite the plight of Detroit, or whether they were satirizing him for not caring about what was happening to Detroit. It's a pretty interesting article to be thrown out there without really any sort of point of view whatsoever.
well, I'll definitely look that up.
Okay, look, yeah,
Does anybody want to comment on that?
I don't want to comment on it because it's kind of a dumb article, but first of all, thank you for a stimulating talk. I would go so far as to say incisive talk, which of course is to be expected from you. Brilliant as always. I had a question about vocabulary, which is the continued use of the word decline, right? Neoliberal decline. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't be using the word destruction, which puts a different kind of agency to the process. And in particular, I think about David Harvey's concept of accumulation by dispossession. We have tens of thousands of structures in this city that have been not just abandoned, but consciously left. And in the case of private homes, there were tens of thousands of people who walked away from all of their equity. And all that money went someplace, not to us. And so I'm just wondering about that term, and in particular, the role of ruin porn as a way of consuming destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the highest order, which of course is Walter Benjamin's epilogue to the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And what he means by that is fascism. So I'm wondering what your comments are to that.
I endorse your comment. That was probably a conflation of neoliberal destruction and urban decline, which is its consequence. So yes, but take your point.
All right, that was it. I'm sorry. It was,
No.
really good. I enjoyed it a lot, of course.
I mean, there's no question you want me to respond to, is there?
Well, just that use of the term. We should be, walking away from the term decline and consciously using the word destruction when we have conversations about this vision of
absolutely.
material.
I'm all for using the term neoliberal destruction.
There's a question.
First of all, my name is Lawrence Porter. I don't go to school here, but I have college and works. I thank you for your presentation. I think it was excellent. And I believe, frankly, that it should be available to a wider audience than only on the campus. I'm a member of the Socialist Equality Party and the International Youth and Social Equality. We had a photograph of the demonstration that we organized at the DIA last October in defense of art and in defense of the DIA. The images that you're presenting, frankly, as far as what I can tell from people that I've spoken to, I live in Detroit, is there's a lot of anger about the social conditions that are now developing. And they want to see something change. I think what you were raising before about the decay of capitalism and the social order which is now developing. Yesterday there was an article, probably saw it, about the fact that you have child infant mortality is worse than it is in some third world countries. That's now being shown down in Detroit. But this is tied to the issue of culture. And frankly, they're destroying the schools, and this is not an accident. You raised that this is not a normal process. I think that many of the images do portray that this is a sort of a decaying and normal development taking place. No, this was definitely the reasons why this is happening. And you raised in your presentation deindustrialization. Well, Detroit, the industrialization process wasn't only in Detroit. This was happening throughout the entire country. You see the same thing now taking place in many cities, which were industrial cities in a different form. I call it the Detroitization of this country. That's what's beginning to take place. You have now massive poverty. My last point is the following. You raised that you believe that this should be a regional consideration in order to have a solution. The fact of the matter is, what's happening in Detroit is not separate from what's happening in the suburbs. If I can end on the following. I was just at a meeting last week of Ferndale teachers, where their wages are being cut 7 to 14%. The teachers' aides are now making $8 to $9 an hour. They qualify for food stamps. This is not only a situation in Detroit. And the conditions do exist to unite people. And the reason why people are fighting is because they're not looking at the ruins, but they're looking at what they've lost. As you said, I've been here now for 50 years. I mean, people had decent homes. Detroit had the highest living standard in the country. And that's the reason why people are fighting, to defend what they have, what they want, not the ruins.
Thank you.
If I could urge one thing, we are going to be holding a workers' inquiry on February 15th. It's going to be here at Wayne State to investigate this bankruptcy and the conspiracy behind what's taking place. I urge you to come.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lucille Noira, and I used to teach at Wayne. My husband Jim still does. And I was just wondering, did you see Anthony Bourdain's program on Detroit, Food in Detroit?
Yes. Did you all hear her? She asked me.
I asked if any
Anthony
of you
Bourdain's
saw,
program.
you know, Bourdain's program, Anthony Bourdain's program on Detroit and food. And I've gotten opinions from a number of people, including our son, who's a musician in Detroit. And they were very disappointed in that because there was so much emphasis on Detroit unicorn and of empty fields, which were beautifully photographed. I mean, that was if there was an A for anything in that program, it was the beautiful photography. But they did not show that the seeds for the new city are already well underway. The young entrepreneurs who are helping, and the Kickstarter programs, and have you heard of Soup, where people get together weekly to raise money and vote on who they think is most deserving, and all these efforts to get businesses like the bicycle company and the watch company and all these new things. And so when I'm looking at all the destruction, I'm also seeing that the seeds for the growth are already here, and I would recommend Model D online as a wonderful place for you to check out if you haven't already. Subscribe to it free to see some of these newer efforts.
What about
And the gardening, the last thing, I'm sorry, the last thing in the Bourdain thing that I did really like, me having been a landscaper for a number of years too, and I'm a passionate gardener, is the community farms and gardens, and even the new charter schools are making farming a big, and eating well, an important aspect of this. And I think that could be where Detroit can be headed.
Hi, it struck me as I'm looking at your images at the end of your presentation that the images that you're distinguishing as somehow making different kind of critiques, Object Orange and the Frozen House, are still very discrete objects in the middle of a kind of empty frame. And I know that the art is not just the photograph of it, but it's the action taken. They're also abandoned. There aren't people in the frames. And I'm wondering, as you were thinking about the ways that art could propose greater ideas about connectivity of problems and the fact that this crowded suburb contributes to the empty center, the fact that nature and culture aren't so divided or in conflict as some of the pictures seem to represent. If you've seen projects that sort of trace connectivity in sort of more overt ways, and that put people back in the frame somehow.
I think that museum exhibitions are good at trying to do that, constructing ways to, putting sets of images together that create connections to life in the city in ways that individual images can't. But I want to say that I'm not really using the term ruin porn. That's why it's not in the title, even though I spent a lot of time talking about it, because I ultimately think it's not a productive term. I think that images, there's always contradictions, and one thing, images are not particularly good at showing causes of things. So that the discourses that surround images, how they're used, is a very important part of the ruin imaginary. And they are constantly being recycled and reused in different ways. And so even the same image can be critical in one context and not in another. So I think that the intention matters, and how that helps, how artists conceptualize why they're doing what they're doing, and how the kinds of context in which those images get exposure can, if you want to play a critical role, they certainly can.
Can I comment on that? Because I think that, I'm Renee Mullen, I'm a professor here at Wayne. I just had a book out with a chapter on Detroit, non-real estate, and I call it non-real estate because I think ruin porn is an accurate phrase, because what we're looking at is not urban light, we're looking at images. And an image can never be expected to do the social work that the term urban light would evoke in me. So, yes, porn is right. I mean, that's the essence of porn. You don't want to be in the room with these people when you look at regular porn. This is precisely the distancing that you articulate and identify at the beginning of your talk, quite rightly. But you can't expect the image to actually produce those narratives. So I think you're right when you like respond to Elena's question. The narratives, the context, I mean, really the images that you showed of the New York Times are much more powerful arguments, I think, than saying, well, can we see the difference between image A and image B? No, they're both the same. The insider outsider debate is actually kind of all right. But really the context in which they are used, the context in which they appear, and the kind of work that they can subsequently do in the work. And I think that the phrase ruin porn actually kind of captures that complexity of how those images work.
Okay.
Dora, if hypothetically Matty Maroon sat down with you and asked you, what should I do with my train station? What would you say to them?
If Matty Maroon asked me that?
Yeah, hypothetically.
Restore it. And find a way to use it. I mean, Matty Maroon, the odd thing about him is that he has sat on it for years and let it decay and done nothing. Matty Maroon owns more real estate in the state of Michigan than any other individual. So it's not clear what his intentions are, but simply letting it decline doesn't seem like the best strategy. What's yours? What would you say to him?
Well, I would say that now, but...
You would say tear it down?
Really?
Yeah.
No.
Well, that's another debate. Yeah.
Well, this is a very provocative talk, and I really look forward to the book. I have some questions just about the things that you saw during your image research. And you did mention the lack of human beings in the photographs that we see of Detroit, and I was wondering if there are photographs that you found that are compelling and critical that have been shot in Detroit by artists, and if they'll be in your book, or if that just isn't on the radar yet. And hopefully yet is the thing. And then the other question I have for you, because you did talk about the way images are disseminated, and that images have power in the way that they function. And I was wondering if you were going to address the agents of dissemination, because I think that that artists, at a certain point, they set their work free, and then they don't get to control. Artists aren't don't have like a fascist control over how their work functions, and so I'm just wondering if that's going to be addressed. And I think you kind of addressed it today, but just those two questions, images of people and the dissemination.
All right, well, images of people, yes, there are definitely artists, some of them in this room today, who take images of people in Detroit and have wonderful bodies of work. They tend not to include ruins in those images. But also Julia Taubman, among the artists that I did show, certainly has a lot more people in her book than the others. But I also agree with you. We can't blame Marchand and Meffren necessarily for how the New York Times uses their images. So yes, images do take on an independent life once you let go of them. And the context and surrounding discourse determines how that meeting is structured. Did I address your questions?
Sure.
Yeah, but no, they're certainly worth good questions that are worth thinking through more.
Hey,
Yes.
Bob Holly, I'm a professor here. I drive through Highland Park and I noticed one other difference. In addition to the lack of people, there are no pictures that you show, I think, that show the ruin between two occupied structures, which is really what does indeed happen in many neighborhoods, where there will both be structures people are living in, relatively well maintained, then a room, and then another structure in a various different mix. Well, there was a tendency here to always have them separate,
Yes.
usually.
No, that's a good observation. I was actually thinking of going to Highland Park and taking some of those pictures myself, because I know exactly what you're talking about, where you have what actually pretty well-maintained houses right next to houses with their roofs falling in and doors. I once rented a flat in Highland Park, so I drove through there not long ago, and the building that I rented my flat in is completely gone. Yes.
Just in response to your question about people and photographs, there are two wonderful photographers who've done people in Detroit. One is Robert Franklin in his book, The Americans, you might know that, and also Enrico Natale. And both of them are, the show of Robert Franklin was not his best, was at the DIA a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago. And it was not a major show there in terms of advertising, but you'd see the people working in the factories under the most awesomely awful conditions and heat and noises. So you could feel the pain. And I mean, in a way, they were showing the capitalism at work in a way it was taking its toll on the people. And both Enrico Natale, I think just showed at MoCan, we were out of town, but he lives in California now, and Robert Franklin, two photographers who developed the inequities of social activities in Detroit.
Yeah, and also Bill Rauhauser, who won the Eminent Artist Award.
Hey Dora, it's a fantastic talk, thank you. I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on the actual meaning of the term sublime, because I think a lot, not that you misuse it, but I think a lot of people don't really understand the true connotations of that and how it relates to the idea of the ruin.
Well, the way that I'm using it, and this is based on the writings of Burke and Kant, who first theorized the sublime, was as a mental, psychological operation that allows you to enjoy what would otherwise be a terrifying and overwhelming experience. And you can only have that pleasurable experience through a remove. And that remove is distance, time, space, and for us, in order to enjoy, which we all do on some level, the images of ruination, that experience of the deindustrial sublime occurs through the remove of representation. But it's a mental process. All right, so this would be the last question.
If it's allowed, if it's a question.
Is it the?
Is there a question?
My name is Michael Richards. I teach cross-road at CCS, and I'm a colleague of Dora's. And Dora, like so many others, I want to thank you for a splendid presentation. And thank you also for clarifying, if I quote you, you don't find the term ruin porn productive. I think it's utterly conceptually vacuous. It does not explain anything. And if anything, because one of the many things I could pick up on, but I want to pick up on the question of the absence of people, which I think is linked to the use of the term ruin porn. And to use a Freudian term, it's a reaction formation. It's a defensive. It's a defensive term. Because I've seen the Robert Frank exhibition at the DIA. I've seen the photographs of Bill Rahauser in the American Renaissance. And what strikes me about those photographs is that, with the exception of one or two people like Corinne Vermeulen, almost no one under the age of 50 could take those photographs. Absolutely no one, because they're virtually ethnographic photographs, right? So they're photographs where you go into the community and you're snapping photographs of people supposedly in the way in which they live. And they remind me, remarkably, of photographs that were taken at World Fairs at the end of the 19th, early 20th century of people of color in the World Fairs. And when you move the frame back, you suddenly realize that these are people who are in zoos, right? So when I look at the Rahauser photographs from the 50s, I find it utterly inconceivable that any photographer under the age of 50 could go around Detroit, feel entitled to go around Detroit and say, I'm going to snap photographs of people of color in Detroit and publish them supposedly to show that I'm concerned with people. So the movement towards the ruin then actually becomes more symptomal. You're right, Dora, and I think it's something really that we need to talk more about. They're symptomal. Of course, no image on its own gives a narrative. That's what our job is. That's the job of thinking, is we provide the narrative. And the curious feature about image, which is built into the image, is that image is intrinsically general, which is why it can do more than one work. So it becomes a symptomal thing. And if it's symptomal, then that means then that the image captures contradictory pressures. So it's not that the decline is normal, it is that the decline is part of these larger processes, because what is it fundamentally then to have the ruin? The ruin is the transfer of capital. That's all it is. It is the shell that remains after the transfer of capital. Well, we are now reading these as signs about the most extraordinary transfer of capital at the global level. And whether we're in Cleveland, whether we're in Leipzig in Germany, or Liverpool, we are part of this process of the extraordinary transfer of capital that we've ever seen. And the image is what allows us to read that. And this stuff about whether people are in it or not completely misses the point. And therefore it becomes defensive.
Well, and this is my concluding point, that we can mobilize such images for emancipatory purposes. I want to thank you all for your questions and comments, and I'll be here. We can continue the conversation. Thank you all for coming.